my views about China. So what I'm going to do here is a complement to all the excellent talks before. I want to provide a different perspective about China's growth miracle. I want to relate that to the British Industrial Revolution and the rise of the American economy and Japan's industrialization. I want to identify some common pattern, also identify the differences, okay? So that would give us a long-term picture about China, even about the world in the future. Of course, in the short run, we have cycles. We have lots of cycles. I'm the one to be trained in the US to start the business cycle. But now I shift to longer-term trend. So I want to give you a portrait of that. The title is meant to be provocative. Okay, so China's long-awaited industrial revolution, past, present, and the future. This is a disclaimer because I work for the US government. It's a semi-government institution. So I want to say that the rise of China is perhaps one of the most important economic and geopolitical events since the original industrial revolution about 250 years ago. The reason is very simple. Despite 2.5 centuries since the English Industrial Revolution, so far we have only had about 10%, or less than 13% of the population living fully industrialized society, fully enjoying modern industrial civilization. But if China is able to manage to finish its industrialization process, we'll be able to have additional 20% of the world population living in industrial civilization. That's a dramatic change to mankind. And also, China's growth is not just benefiting Chinese people themselves. It's igniting new growth across the globe, across Asia, Latin America, Africa, and even the industrialized West, thanks to the country's colossal demand for raw materials, energy, trade, capital flows, commerce. And, but China's rapid growth in the past 3 decades has paused many people, including economists. I was trained in the US, and even including Chinese themselves. I strongly believe lots of Chinese government officials and economists, they still don't know how come we come to this place, what's going on. So how could a nation with 1.4 billion people transform itself suddenly from a vastly impoverished agricultural land into a formidable industrial powerhouse, when so many tiny nations have been unable to do so despite their more favorable socio-economic geopolitical conditions? So that's the question I would like to answer. Well, there are already many theories proposed to explain China's rapid growth. But among them, I want to point out 2 polar views, and many views may be lying in between. Okay? So 2 stand out as the most popular and provocative. The first view sees China's hypergrowth as a gigantic government-engineered bubble. So China's growth is not sustainable. Okay, and it will collapse sooner or later because, according to this view, China has no democracy, no human rights, no freedom of speech, no rule of law, no Western-style legal system, no well-functioning markets. China still has lots of state-owned enterprises, no private banking sector, no protection of intellectual properties, no ability to innovate except copying and stealing Western technologies and business secrets, nor a host of many other things that the West has possessed for centuries since the Renaissance that have proved to be essential for Western prosperity and technological dominance. So if you don't have those, therefore you cannot boom. Even if you boom, it has to be short-lived. So that's this view. This view is very popular. There's another view on the other extreme to explain China. Second view sees China's dramatic rise simply as a destiny. It's simply a return to its historical position. China used to be very rich, one of the richest nations and the greatest civilizations in the world, alongside India, from at least 200 BC all the way to 1800, when British Industrial Revolution took place. So therefore, it was just a matter of time for China to reclaim its historical glory and dominate the world once again. As Napoleon once said, China is a sleeping giant. Let her sleep. Once she wakes up, she's going to shake the world. So this is another view. So therefore, China's rise is just a matter of time. It's sooner or later, it's destiny. I disagree with both views. I don't think either view is fully founded, is correct. So first of all, how could a nation with all those adverse elements for business and innovation be able to grow at a double-digit annual rate for several decades, for so long, and transform itself fundamentally, although this process still has not finished? Also, secondly, if culture or ancient civilization, the historical glory is the explanation for China's rise, then why we are not seeing Egyptian, Greek, or Ottoman empires bursting onto the world stage? So in this talk, I want to provide a different view about China. Hopefully it complements the other views we have already seen. But simple fact we know, and let me go briefly. 35 years ago, or 40 years ago now, per capita income in China was very low, and just 1/3 of sub-Saharan Africa. So Africa, since my childhood education, we're told Africa is very poor, the poorest area in the world. But China's income level was even lower than that. But today, China is already the world's largest manufacturing powerhouse. The crude steel level is 800 level of US, 50% of the global capacity. Cement, 60% of global capacity. Vehicle production, more than a quarter of global supply. Industrial patent application is larger than the sum of US and Japan. Also, the world's largest producer of ships, high-speed trains, robots, tunnels, bridges, highways, chemical fibers, machine tools, computers, cell phones, and you name it. Lots of stuff. So this is the manufacturing output value added for the top 5 countries in 2015. So you can see China rise from the bottom, passing all the industrial powers one by one, and eventually pass the US around 2010. So this is a patent application. The red one is China, again, rose from the bottom and passed every industrial powers. So this is not a bubble. If this is a bubble, I talk to all my friends from developing countries, they say they want that bubble, they want it. So here me quote a phrase, a paragraph from Stephen Chang, one of the famous Chinese economists. He's a new institutional theorist. He said, I can easily write a thick book in a week to criticize China. China has lots of problems, we know. Okay, we can criticize China, no problem. And it's good to criticize, okay? That helps China to develop. But however, the fact that China's miracle growth has been lasting for so long, despite so many hostile socio-political conditions, is truly amazing and unprecedented. China must have done something so profoundly right. What is it? That is the real challenge. So if we cannot identify what China has done right, then we are not able to explain China, then we are not able to predict China's future, and we are not able to predict the entire world, and not able to help other developing countries to grow. So therefore, it's relatively easy to criticize China, but far more challenging to find out what China has done right. That's the important thing. So how did China achieve all this in just 35 years or less than 40 years? My short answer is that China, ever since the late Qing dynasty's Yangwu movement, Yangwu Yundong, has finally, through trial and error, rediscovered the secret recipe of the original Industrial Revolution, which started in the UK more than 200 years ago. So this is like I'm just repeating the thesis provided by Justin Lin. There's a recipe, okay, but we need to find it. The UK found it 250 years ago. Later on, France found it, Germany found it, America found it, Japan found it. Today, China found it. But what is it? So that we can help other developing countries to emulate it. So So what is secret recipe, and why did China not find it before? China have tried more than 100 years. And why have many other nations still not found it? Can China finish its course? As I said earlier, China has not finished its course yet. And if so, when and what are the challenges ahead? So, given my time, I try to push as far as I can. And also, how can other nations benefit from China's rise? This is the picture, this is data composed by Gregory Clark, one of the most well-known economic historians in the US. This average income, this average global income starting about 1000 BC up to today. So you can see before the British Industrial Revolution, the entire world, doesn't matter which monarchy you live in or what culture you have, basically you live in Methuselah trap. Okay, then until about 1800, there's so-called global divergence. A few nations in the West Europe start to rise, and permanently, and the rest of the world is still fluctuating around Methuselah trap. So that's the picture of Industrial Revolution. And unfortunately, only a few nations succeeded in emulating the British Industrial Revolution, which basically started around 1760 when Adam Smith wrote his famous book, and roughly finished around 1900. Okay, took them more than 100 years. The first group of nations successfully emulated the British Industrial Revolution, of course, in the northwestern Europe, between around 1820 until shortly after World War II. Second is the United States, roughly around the same period. Third one is Japan in Asia, started about half a century later and finished about 20 years after World War II. And the Asian tigers started much later after World War II and used much shorter time to enter the club of high-income country, although not every one of Asian tigers has fully finished industrialization process. I will, if I have time, I'll come back to explain why. For example, the per capita income in Taiwan and South Korea is only about 50 or 60% of US. There's still room for them to further industrialize. So put them together, it's less than 15% of world population. The global population now is more than 7 billion. Now, why only a few nations succeeded? It's not because other poor nations have not tried. They have tried many, many times. For example, Egypt started first attempt, nationwide attempt at emulating industrial revolution around 1820, and tried 6 to 8 times, failed. Today still has not ignited its industrial revolution process, still trying. Well, we have a lot of theories. The most popular one is the so-called new institutional theory. It says it's a political institution. So this institutional theory is very popular in the US, extremely popular in China. Almost every Chinese economist I have met is subscribed to this view. Right, except Justin. So this theory is quite simple if we put in words. Basically, it says there are two types of institutions. One is called inclusive, another one called extractive. If we have inclusive institutions such as democracy, then you put restrictions on the elite class. And therefore, that means the free market can flourish, and you have free trade, you have good protection of private property rights, then you have rule of law. That means individuals have incentive to accumulate wealth, and they can innovate, therefore they can grow. Okay, so that's the view. On the other hand, if we have extractive institutions such as dictatorship, then you have no freedom of choice. Then you cannot protect private property rights. Then you have no rule of law. And that means no incentive to work hard, to accumulate capital, to innovate. Therefore, that means poverty. Okay, so that's the view. Therefore, what's the solution for poverty? Well, democracy. That's the way to go. And I think many developed nations' government subscribed to this view with a good intention. They said, okay, look at the poverty around the world. UK industrialization has taken place for 250 years. Your country is still poor. Let's change your institution. If you don't change it, we'll help you. But unfortunately, this theory cannot square with facts. And we have seen so many democracies with pervasive economic stagnation and continuous political turmoil. Such countries include Africa, Egypt, Iraq, Libya, Pakistan, Thailand, Tunisia, Ukraine, and you can list and go on. So this does not consider with modern practice. But you may say that time is not long enough. Okay, if we give them longer time, 100 years, 200 years, maybe eventually they're going to emerge. So therefore, we don't know. So this is not evidence good enough to contradict with this theory. Now let me go to history. We also see extractive institutions that have been economically strong. They include Germany between 1850 until World War II, and also Soviet Russia between middle 19th century until World War II. And also later on, I want to say more. The reason Industrial Revolution was kickstarted by UK was not because of democracy in UK. So I haven't put out all those historical evidence which contradict this view. Even though new institutional theorists like Douglas North, like Acemoglu, they point out glorious revolution as the key point to trigger industrial revolution. I will dispute with that, and I think most economic historians would agree with me, including McCloskey, Clark, Robert Allen, those people. Okay. So also let's see other contradicting evidences. New Russia's dismal failure in economic reform under shock therapy. They adopted democracy, changed the political system, and changed their economic system from so-called extractive to inclusive. They failed. And also Japan's rapid industrialization starting in the Meiji Restoration area was not under democracy. And the most rapid growth area before World War II, Japan was under military regime. And South Korea's economic takeoff in the 60s, 80s, which was critical for South Korea's long-term growth, was under dictatorship. I'm not advocating dictatorship is the necessary condition. I'm just saying, this contradicts with the theory. Also, Singapore's post-independence economic miracle we know is under authoritarian government. Also, you look at the US, under identical political institutions across the nation, identical property rights, identical rule of law, you see pockets of both extreme poverty and pockets of extreme wealth. You see pockets of violent crime and obedience to law. Also, you look at Italy, the same nation, under the same umbrella of rule of law, same institutions, southern Italy is far poorer than northern Italy. So therefore, this theory needs to improve, okay, or could be wrong. Here, I'm going to quote a paragraph from an economic historian at Harvard University. He said, the first industrial nation, Great Britain, was hardly a liberal, lean state with dependable but impartial institutions as it is often portrayed. Instead, it was an imperial nation characterized by enormous military expenditures, a nearly constant state of war, a powerful and interventionist bureaucracy, high taxes, skyrocketing government debt, and a protectionist tariff. And it was certainly not democratic. So this was the institutional feature of UK when UK was going through industrial revolution. You said, well, this person is not famous enough. I have not heard of him. Let me quote another historian. He's very famous, Joe Mercier. He said, the British society provided, before Industrial Revolution and during the initial phase of Industrial Revolution, British society provided little law and order to protect industrial properties and human rights before the Industrial Revolution, and it had a surprising quantity of robbers. Local rioting, either for economic or political grievances, was common. It had no professional police force compared to that emerged after 1830. Around 1830, UK finished the first industrial revolution already, and was just kick-starting the second industrial revolution. And the court system was unwieldy, expensive, and uncertain. Britain depended on the deterrent effect of draconian penalties, very severe penalties, to deter crimes. Because it had no official mechanism of law enforcement, prosecution was mostly private. And the crime prevention was largely self-enforcing with more than 80%. This is more than what we see in the worst country in Africa. Okay, more than 80% of all prosecutions carried out by the victims themselves. So this is not rule of law. Rule of law can be written on paper. You look at any country's constitution in the world, the written words about rule of law is wonderful, but does not mean in practice. So now let me come back to China. This Chinese economic reform and the growth miracle since followed is not China's first attempt at industrialization. Okay, it has had 3 attempts before. The first one started in the early 1860s after being defeated by the British during the Second Opium War, and took China half-century to struggle to try to finish industrialization, but failed. And because of that failure, there was a bloody revolution, overthrow the monarchy, and established the first so-called republic government in China. That's the 1911 Qinghai Revolution. And that political regime emulated American system, separation of powers, and giving ordinary people far more attention. But 40 years later, that attempt of industrialization didn't go very well, and the majority of the peasants remain extremely poor. That's why there's another round of revolution. So I was talking to my friend Eric about the French Revolution. And so the rise of communism was not from vacuum, was a severe response to the severe economic social conditions. Dramatic market failures under private property system did not industrialize China and did not enrich people. So that's why there was a severe response. That's communism. And 1994, that's the third attempt at industrialization. They said, well, we have spent 100 years, wasted our time trying to industrialize. We are still poor. We are still beaten by the Western powers. Therefore, we need to find another way. So what's another way? Capitalism did not give us industrialization. Let's try socialism. So they mimic Russia, hoping that we could rapidly industrialize by mimicking Russia, but didn't succeed. So then by 1978, after the death of Mao, China decided to try another way. It was still very poor. But before I start, what is different this time compared to the earlier 3 times and compared to other nations' industrialization experience? Let me ask 2 questions. The 3 failures in China's history before the recent economic reform, was it because lack of free market and private property rights? No. Most economic historians in Europe, in the US, in Japan, and in China today have a consensus. The private land property rights and the market system in Qing Dynasty China was as good as Europe and the UK, or even better, but did not industrialize China. And you may say, well, despite the very good market system and property right protection, but your high-level government is corrupted. The Qing Dynasty monarchy is bad. Then, that's precisely what the Shanghai Revolution did. They overthrew the monarchy, they changed the political regime, and they kept the private property right at a lower level, kept the market system at a lower level. Didn't work for 40 years. It's internal civil war fight among the mafias and the military crews everywhere. It's also not lack of natural resources, even though despite the fact China is poor in natural resources. So why did China fail in the previous attempt? Here also I want to even though time is tight, I still want to give you some picture of the situation in China before communism under private property system. So this is a message written by a French priest, traveled to China between 1839 and 1851. He learned Mandarin, knew all the Chinese officials, traveled to the countryside, has enormous experience about China. Here's what he wrote. There can be found in no other country such disastrous poverty as in the Celestial Empire, the middle income, central income. Not a year passes in which a terrific number of persons do not perish of famine. Let a drought, a flood, or any accident whatever occur to injure the harvest in a single province, then 2/3 of the entire population are immediately reduced to starvation. You see them forming up into numerous bands, perfect armies of beggars, proceeding together, men, women, and children, to seek some little nourishment in the towns and villages. Many faint by the wayside and die before they can reach the place where they had hoped for help. You see their bodies lying in the fields and by the roadside, and you pass without taking notice. So familiar is the horrible spectacle. That situation repeats almost every year in China under private market system. They say, well, because the monarchy is corrupt, they don't care about the ordinary people's life. Let's see what happened after the revolution, which get rid of the monarchy. That revolution was even more thorough than glorious revolution in UK. They did not just keep the monarchy, they killed all the emperors and drove them away. But this revolution did not change China's miserable rural landscape and agricultural market failure. The revolution introduced plural political system, inclusive institution into China at the top, but inherited the Qing dynasty private land ownership at the bottom. So here's the British economist historian wrote after traveling to China in the 1920s. He wrote about the devastating situation in Chinese peasant farmers. There are districts in which the position of the rural population is that of a man standing permanently up to the neck of in water, so that even a ripple is sufficient to drown them. In Shanxi province, for example, at the beginning of 1931, which is 20 years after Shanghai Revolution, 3 million persons had died of hunger in the last few years, and the misery had been such that 400,000 women and children had changed hands by sales. But each year during those bad times, there's no food. You sell the wives and children in the market to exchange for food. Wonderful market system. You say, well, that's just 20 years, it's not long enough for democracy to work. This is written by an American writer, William Hinton, in the 1940s. He lived in China also for many years. He wrote about China's harsh realities of death by starvation during the annual spring hunger. Every year, during the springtime, there was a shortage of food. The food ran out before they grow new crops. When food reserve run out, and of the slavery, most of the girls, landlord violence, domestic violence, usury, endemic mafia-style secret societies, and other associated brutalities that characterize everyday life in China. So that's the background when communism arose. Okay, such is the situation facing many, actually not just China, pre-industrial agricultural societies. It served as a socio-economic foundation for the rise of communism and a radical land reform in China, led by Mao's Communist Party. So it was a harsh response to harsh reality. So what has China done differently this time? The first time, China suddenly succeeded to embark on a path of industrialization. The first time took a very humble, gradualist, pragmatic experimental approach. I want to describe it first, then I will come up with a theory. Okay, this is just a description, maybe just unique to China, or may be shared by all the successful industrial nations. So first of all, we know that Deng Xiaoping's reform took a very gradual, pragmatic approach with the following features. Number one, it maintained political stability at all costs. I don't want to impose a moral judgment for whether this is right or wrong, but this is what Deng Xiaoping, the Chinese government has done. no more revolutions. We tried many revolutions in the past, it didn't work. And they focus on the grassroots. Qing Dynasty did not focus on grassroots. The Republic era did not focus on grassroots. The communism movement did focus on the grassroots, but they used the wrong method. This time, they also focus on grassroots, the bottom-up reforms starting in the rural area in agriculture instead of the financial sector. Deng Xiaoping did not start reforming the financial sector, privatize the banking system. Later on, I'm going to say this is very important. Promote rural industries despite their primitive technologies, use manufactured goods instead of owning natural resources to exchange for foreign currency, to exchange for foreign imported machineries. And enormous government support at every level, from central government all the way down to village level, to support infrastructure build up, to support enticing foreign investment. Dual-track system, as Justin mentioned, with mixed ownership instead of wholesale privatization, like Russia did, and move off the industrial ladder from light industry to heavy industry gradually, based on your comparative advantage, constantly pointed out by Justin, from labor-intensive production to capital-intensive production, from manufacturing to financial capitalism, and from high-saving state to consumeristic welfare state. China is not there yet. So after that description of Chinese characteristics, now let me give you a general pattern of the Industrial Revolution, which is shared by almost every successful industrialized nations, okay, from Europe to US to Japan to South Korea. So I characterize them into several stages. First stage is called proto-industrialization, mentioned by historian like Mendels, which took very long, took UK 300 years to finish that phase. That process features craftsman workshops, mostly in the rural area, but producing goods for long-distance trade, not to satisfy local needs. That's important, for long-distance trade, okay? Then there's the phase of first industrial revolution, which features labor-intensive mass production for mass market, means global market. Then it features the phase of industrial trinity boom. Trinity means energy, locomotive power, infrastructure. But depending on the time, the concrete form is different, but the essence is the same. In the UK, started is a coal, a steam engine, railroad. Later on may become oil, embossed engine, and maybe highways. But the essence is the same, it's industrial trinity. Then it kickstarts the second industrial revolution, which features mass production of the means of mass production. Okay, all the means, intermediate goods, machineries, tools, and that. So that's the fourth phase. Then once the society finishes the fourth phase, then your productivity becomes so high, you close the loop. You're not only able to mass produce final goods, you're also able to mass produce the means of mass production, the machineries. Then you're ready to enter welfare state, which includes two aspects of welfare. One is economic welfare, including social safety net, like unemployment insurance, free education. You have political welfare, including human rights, democracy, end of death penalty, rights for handicapped people, for prisoners. Okay, those things. But those stages is not like clear cut. They overlap for some period. But the peak of the wave comes later. Okay, come later. So now, let me briefly go through the UK, give you some examples. I'm quite confident apply to almost all the industrialized countries. And all the countries they tried, they failed because they didn't follow these steps. They tried to jump to the last step from the very beginning. So look at the UK. At least starting 1600, even before, I would think 16th century. And until middle 18th century, was several hundred years of proto-industrialization in rural areas, organized and financed by rich merchants, supported by monarchy government. and the Royal Navy. Then Britain kickstarted the first industrial revolution, which featured mostly starting in the textile industry, then later on moved to industrial trinity, the coal, steam engine, and railroad. So this is the UK, under the help of the government, created the largest global textile market for UK craftsmen workshops, and the global largest cotton supply chains for British rural industries. So that was the key to kickstart the first industrial revolution. Industrial revolution means mass production, and mass production requires mass market. Yet, our economic theory does not tell us that the market does not exist or given by God. Market is a public good. It's a most fundamental public good, which can only be created by joint effort, especially by the state, especially the global market. So UK was able to create the largest global textile market for their textile handicraft industry and the raw material supply chains. That facilitated the first industrial revolution. Then because of enormous demand for cargo shipping, that made the primitive road and canals inadequate to move cargoes. Therefore, they triggered the industrial trinity boom, the coal mine revolution, and the steam engine technology adoption, and the railroad boom. So that's around 1830, 1850. And through that process, you want to build a massive amount of railroad, you need to mass produce raw materials like steels. You need to mass produce steam engine and its parts. So that triggered the second industrial revolution, which mass produced the means of mass production. And it started around the middle 19th century when Karl Marx was writing his manifesto, and ended around 1900. Then, since 1900, the UK was ready to enter welfare state and provide welfare for ordinary workers. And about 1928, had universal suffrage available. So democracy, fully democracy started that time. You look at America. Before 1820, ever since Columbus, ever since maybe at least since independence, US has also gone through a couple hundred years of rural industrialization. Then kick-started the first industrial revolution around 1820 based on stolen technology from UK. We know American founding father stolen the textile technology from UK, okay? And so the first industrial revolution covers the period of 1820 until around sort of middle 19th century Civil War. So mass production of textiles based on imported or stolen British technology. Then that created tremendous demand for cargo, therefore for infrastructure. Then there was a boom around 1830 to 1870 based on British technology for railroad. And then that triggered the second industrial revolution around 1870 and finished around the Second World War. So it's during the second industrial revolution, America catch up with the UK, become a #1 manufacturing powerhouse. And universities come even much later. So American finished second industrial revolution essentially before World War II, making US the largest superpower, was able to defeat Germany and Japan. And after World War II, US, even though economically and technologically was ready to enter welfare state, but the government did not automatically give it to people. It's people's movement, fights, civil rights movement, mass amount in the 60s in every corner of society, and the universal suffrage was granted in 1965 to every people, but not to American Indians yet, but including black people. Violence Against Women Act signed into law in 1994. That's a long time after finishing industrial revolution. Same-sex marriage legalized in 2015. Very late. So 100 years from now, the Chinese will look at the Americans and say, your human rights was worse than ours. But even today, the US still has not ended death penalty. Ending death penalty is one of the features of welfare state. I think in Europe all ended. US has not yet. Look at Japan. Even Japan, before the Meiji Restoration, because Japan was backward compared to China's civilization, however, Japan had a backward advantage. during China's Tang Dynasty and the Song Dynasty, China experienced rapid movement of commerce and sort of primitive industrialization, but did not continue. But Japan mimicked that starting in the 17th century. And right after that, connect to Western industrialization, of course, the fourth door opened by Americans. So in a sense, Japan had a century, 200 years of peace and rural commercialization. Now, once the door forced opened by the Westerners, they feel they will be beaten, so therefore need to create a global market. They start Meiji Restoration. The initial phase is to continue finishing its rural industrialization process. Then around 1890, when the market was fermented enough, based on stolen Western technology, textile, they kick-started the first industrial revolution by mass-producing textile goods and exporting low value-added, labor-intensive goods to the Western market, also to China and to Asia, relying on imported machineries. Then around 1900, under the help of government, they kick-started the industrial Trinity boom, massively built railroad and electrified the nation. Then kick-started the second industrial revolution around 1920, and it was interrupted because Japan was become so successful in industrialization and was ready to enter global war, fighting the superpowers, but luckily was defeated, and then after World War II rebuilt, then continued its process to finish the industrialization that entered the welfare state around the late 1960s. Even early 1960s, went to Japan. Japan was extremely poor in the rural area, and the human rights was very bad. Okay. So look at China. China, after economic reform, used about less than 40 years, rapidly emulated the several phases of the Western Industrial Revolution. Has not finished. Okay. So I divided that into several 10 years, decade, just for easiness. The first 10 years after reform, China started so-called 乡镇企业, village township enterprises. That's essentially rural industrialization like the US, Europe, and Japan had. But also, China had institutional innovations. Those proto-industries, they were not completely private. They were collectively owned by villagers. But still, they went through the same process. And during that period, 10 years period, unnoticed by Westerners, but by some economists, because this is a primitive technology. I mean, will not catch the eye of economists. Number of village firms increased by 12-fold, and the village industrial gross output increased by 13-fold. This is a dramatic revolutionary change. Very invisible because of primitive technology, okay, but critical to kickstart the industrial revolution. Village peasant workers increased to nearly 100 million. And the farmers' aggregate wage income increased by 12-fold. And around the middle 80s, just a few years after the reform, through village proto-industrialization, China almost ended the shortage problem, the so-called, and solved the food security. I think Justin was also one of the first to answer the Western question, can China feed itself? Even by very early 1990, Justin's answer was yes. Okay, that time surprised many people. And then the second phase, because of that phase, rapidly allowed China to use proto-industrialization to ferment the market, to raise farmers' income, to train the farmers, to become the reserve army of industries. So China kickstarted the first industrial revolution in the late 1980s. Massive amount of labor-intensive big factories started to emerge in China. And only a few years later, 1995, China already became, this is not well noticed, China already became the world's largest producer and exporter of textiles in 1995, which is 6 years before WTO. This is very important. Lots of people say it is WTO industrialized China. So many poor nations joined WTO. Look across Africa, South Asia. Let me mention India and Russia. make a little difference. But once China joined WTO, conquered the world. Why? Because China was the only one of the few nations that was ready. Chance belongs only to the people prepared. China was ready. China was already #1 textile producer and exporter. Was waiting for the global market. If the global market did not come, what China would do, like the British Navy force, they're going to force their door open to create a global market by force, military force. But fortunately, after World War II, we have a peaceful international organization. There's a market there. You want to join, you pay some fee, and you concede with some other conditions, then you allow in, so you don't have to create a global market by military force. And China needs that global market. Okay. So that's explaining China's continuous boom after joining WTO. And during that period, village firm continued booming. Village firm workers reached 30% of China's entire rural labor force. It was dramatic. And village industrial output grew about close to 30% per year between the year of reform and 2000. So that's about 22 years of continuous growth, doubling every 3 years. Imagine that speed of change, okay? 66-fold increase. Even we discount this by inflation, average inflation in that period is about 6%. You still have 22% of growth, still roughly 3.5 years doubling the economy, doubling economy, yeah. Then around late 1990s, China's tremendous demand for cargo for shipping made China's government communism-built railroad so inadequate. And China's saving rate was so high that triggered the industrial Trinity boom. Massive amount of highway get built, and a massive amount of railroad get built, and it started the speed train. I remember in the beginning of reform, the high government officials in the early 1980s allowed to visit the US, and coming back, very sad. They said, look, no matter how hard we try, we can adopt all the capitalism system, adopt democracy. We cannot catch the US. Even build the same highway like the US would take us 100 years or 1,000 years. Hopeless. But if you follow the industrial path in the correct way, they only spend less than 10 years, build a highway 50% longer than the US system, with a speed way 50% longer than the global system. So if China start building highway in the 1980s, you're going to go bankrupt. Then you still don't understand why. You're going to say, oh, because of lack of democracy. And then you try democracy, it did not kill corruption, steal crop like Brazil. Then you say, oh, because of our bad culture. You go back to cultural revolution, you change the culture, you still fail. You say, oh, our gene has a problem. So then you get into a vicious cycle because you missed the right recipe for industrialization. And the institutions are endogenous. As the industrialization goes on, they're going to push for institutional changes because that's part of the soft infrastructure, as Jocelyn pointed out, that things will come. Okay. And 2.6 million miles public roads get built, and 28 provinces now, out of 30, are covered by high-speed trains. And China today entered the second phase of the later phase of industrial revolution. So where's China now? So this is Professor Wilson mentioned. China has not finished the second industrial revolution. Still has huge room to improve. China now is just becoming the #1 producer of steel, which US became in late 19th century, which Japan became around 1930 or 40. China is just that stage. China has still value chain to climb, still has a backward late come advantage, and also every nation, once they entered the second industrial revolution, even though they are emulating UK technology, they will automatically become inventors of technology, because the second industrial revolution is heavy industry, which has long production chains, long industrial chains, and has lots of specialty adapted to local conditions. You have to innovate. So that's why China's patent numbers start to increase dramatically. And now, is this the triumph of Marxism? This missing spelling is Marxism. or laissez-faire? Yes and no. Yes, for obvious reasons. China needs market, of course. Complete social planning will not do, because the market imposes economic incentives to compete and impose discipline on management and technology adoption, and also impose Darwinian type of creative destruction to eliminate losers. Okay, but this is not the whole story. If adopting market is a story, China would have industrialized during Qing Dynasty, which had a better market system than Europe, or also during the Republic era. Something else is missing. So no, for overlooked reasons. I want, like a state capacity, industrial policy. Here let me mention another three. Market is a public goods with three pillars. Without them, market will collapse, even you created it. Number one, political stability, which we take for granted. Number two, social trust, which we take for granted. Number three, infrastructure. Across human history, there are several waves of infrastructure built. Initially, it was given by God. So old civilization flourished around the rivers. You have a river, you can transport, we have old civilization. But that's it. You cannot go further than that. Later on, canal system started with the Dutch government. Okay, canal, primitive canal, connected together, started the proto-industrialization. This primitive road, the horse track, then railroad, highways, then speed trains, airplanes. So all those waves need the government to play an important role. So market is a public goods, which is extremely to create, okay? So therefore, it is extremely costly for independent anarchic peasants to form cooperatives to compete. They don't trust each other. Where do they get their saving together? Where's the bank to lend to them? Unless political stability and social trust exist. Also, it's extremely costly to create mass market to support the division of labor and mass production. It is also extremely costly to create market regulatory institutions to prevent the cheating and fraud. I mentioned the cheating fraud in the US, 19th century, in China. So those things, they are going to destroy the market if you do not crack them down. All of them is very costly, and it is precisely those type of cost and the lack of understanding of such cost and the state capacity and the correct industrial policy to overcome such a cost, which destroyed Russia under shock therapy. Russia still don't know why. You know, we have a European tradition culture. During the planning economy, at least, we were big, we were strong to compete with the US, even though we have to reform. But now we adopt the American system, how come we collapse? They don't understand, because they don't know those costs. They thought the laissez-faire would automatically make Russia like a US. And precisely also the lack of understanding of those costs and the lack of state capacity and industrial policy to overcome such costs that trapped Africa and also Latin America into either poverty trap or middle income trap, despite the rhetoric of democracy, private property rights, the rule of law, and liberalism. So how to create a mass market? Without a mass market, you cannot have mass production. Without a mass production, you cannot become rich. That's simple. Well, early European powers relied on mercantilist state government and powerful militarized merchants to create monopolist global market, of course, through colonialism, imperialism, and slave trade. And let me quote this famous merchant and warrior, Dutch warrior. He was one of the one-term CEO of Dutch East Indian Company. He said, "We cannot carry on trade without a war, nor war without trade. Use war to finance trade, use trade to finance war. That's how you create a global market." And generations of British monarchies and merchants, for example, the British East Indian Company, helped create for England the world's largest textile market, which Netherlands failed to do that. The cotton supply chains and the trading network, that kick-started the first industrial revolution. It's not a glorious revolution, which was a result, a side product of this process of proto-industrialization. Today, developing nations no longer have such privilege to create a global market in the brutal way, okay? And they don't have the time They spent several hundred years to nurture the proto-industries to create a global market. So therefore, they need to try some other method. What a method? China offered some example, okay, not necessarily the model, but offered example, which is government, every level government must play a bigger role to help create market, to help provide political stability, to help provide social trust, to help build infrastructure. But following the right sequence, you don't want to jump into a high-speed train at the very beginning. So, but people read Adam Smith, they read a different message. Let me give you the other Adam Smith, which you have ignored. He said that in the longhouses and very small villages scattered about in the highlands of Scotland, every farmer must be butcher, baker, and brewer his family. Basically, you cannot have division of labor because of lack of market, not because of lack of private property rights. Adam Smith didn't mention private property rights. You don't have the market. And therefore, neither or no commerce in any kind between the distant part of the world. What goods could bear the expense of land carriage between London and Calcutta in India? Or if there were any so precious goods so as to be able to support this expense, across the Silk Road, thousand miles, with what safety could they be transported through the territories of so many barbarian nations? So it is upon the sea coast and along the banks of navigable rivers that industry of every kind naturally begin to subdivide and improve itself. And it is frequently not till a long time after that those improvements extend themselves to the inner land, because the inner land has no rivers or no transportation. So this kind of market creation process is a lengthy process, and you need a collective joint effort. Of course, you need aiming at the market system. So this is Justin said, you need a facilitating government aiming at creating market, ensure market can function. Market does not automatically exist and function by itself. No, it's a public good. Okay. So the fundamental reason, let me conclude. The fundamental reason the UK, instead of the Netherlands, which was far more advanced than UK before, kick-started the Industrial Revolution was because of its successful creation of the world's largest textile market and the cotton supply chains. Mass production has constant supply of raw materials in the 18th century, which made the nationwide adoption of the spinning jenny and the factory system profitable and inevitable. The spinning jenny could be long invented, but there was no industrial profit to adopt that, unless you have a global market. Which farmer, isolated farmer, want to adopt a mass production or mass machine given by even free? You have no place to sell. You wouldn't do that. Okay. So likewise, the fundamental reason the US, instead of France or Germany, overtook the UK to become the next economic superpower was not because the US institution was better than UK institution. No. But it was because the US government helped the US merchants and enterprises to create an even larger manufacturing goods market in the 19th century, larger than UK, larger than lots of European countries combined, which nurtured the world's greatest inventors, such as Thomas Edison, and industrial giants, such as Andrew Carnegie, Henry Ford, Morgan, J.P. Morgan, and Rockefeller, and Vanderbilt. Those giants emerged because of huge market. So the fundamental reason the Industrial Revolution took place, the fundamental reason, I think it's some misspacing here. First, the England. Let me skip this, and I'll go back to why people ask India did not start, China didn't start. So because their government did not help. India was not even a nation, not even a state. Who's going to help the Indian merchants to create a global market, even though they're better at producing textiles by hand than the British machines? No use. You need a state to create a global market. Chinese government didn't help their merchants at all. Their merchants in the South China Sea went to Beijing, so help us. The Dutch are coming. They took over our market. The market said that you're on your own. So today, China, instead of India, is better positioned to overtake the US in manufacturing and technological innovation in the 21st century because the Chinese government has helped and continue helping, creating for China a gigantic market that is several times larger than the US. So let me conclude. This is my proposition for the new stage theory. How can we help other developing countries to develop? So there are several principles. This is Adam Smith. Division of labor or the degree of industrialization is limited by the extent of the market. But the market is a public good with three pillars: political stability, social trust, infrastructure. A modern industrial market, however, can only be created in a distinctive stage. You cannot be done in one time. Okay, hence, one big push is a bad strategy. Okay, hence development is a sequential process of market creation from bottom up, from rural to urban, then back to rural. Okay, agricultural mechanization only come later after you started heavy industrialization because modern agriculture requires machineries, requires knowledge, which is very capital intensive. China now is already started to enter the last phase of second industrial revolution, which is agricultural mechanization. Now you go to China, you start to see it. So this follows the law of development. So in 20 years, and my friend Xiaobo Zhang told me he's even more optimistic. He traveled to China, rural everywhere. He said just 10 years, China will be able to fully modernize its agricultural sector. Then China is done with industrialization, will enter full-fledged welfare state. So hence, so no matter how late a nation started its development, it must repeat in one way or another earlier stage to succeed. You cannot just jump forklift forward. Start with heavy industry, which is the strategy Jocelyn criticized over and over again. So in contrast, poor countries are too eager, and modern economic theory will teach them so, to leap forward, to start industrialization by building advanced capital-intensive industries, automobile assembly lines, or setting up a modern financial system, like Russia did after reform, or erecting modern political institutions which you cannot support. You adopt democracy when you're still primitive agriculture, it's going to become sour and rotten. It's not going to be well-functioning. But such top-down approach is violated the historical sequence of the Industrial Revolution and also violated the fundamental economic principle that supply does not create its own demand. Okay, thank you very much. I'm done.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Professor Wen. And because of the timing, so we restrict to 5 minutes. I know that you may have a lot of questions, but please restrict your question to one sentence, if possible. And Terry
I'll be really quick. Firstly, of course, no contemporary observer recognized an industrial revolution. Neither Smith, Ricardo, John Stuart Mill. This is very much a retrospective view. And why should they? Because growth was around 2.5% per annum. The other point I should, I think, take you up on is your reading of Smith. I mean, actually, what Smith says, this is his expression, without tolerable security, there will be no meaningful economic activity. Tolerable security is security of property and income. And he's making what should be the very obvious point, that unless you have that kind of security, of course, you're not going to have meaningful, serious economic activity. So property rights are important to Smith. The other condition for economic activity, because he mentions two, that's one, is the deluded perception that welfare or happiness is a function of material consumption. As long as people behave in what he calls a greedy, selfish way, providing you've got tolerable security, as far as he's concerned, you will have economic activity, period.
Okay. Thank you for those questions. I think this is. I failed to explain myself earlier. When I say those things, I did not say property right is not important, market is not important. I'm saying those are far from sufficient. Look at all the nations. Marcus pointed out, thousands years we live in private property system, okay? But industrial property laws come later. That was a response to development industrialization itself, because like accounting laws, other things. So basically, private property was there everywhere in any nation. Qing Dynasty, they had private property. The monarchist tax rate in Qing Dynasty was very low, 4% a year, compared to UK. Even after the Glorious Revolution, under so-called property, rule of law was 30%. So private property was basically everywhere. I don't think there was a fundamental distinction between UK and Qing Dynasty about private property. Okay, those are there. Of course, you like North Korea, rule out completely. Of course, you don't go. But those are extreme. Okay, so therefore, even like in the early phase of Deng Xiaoping's reform, of course, they give back the farmers a certain type of property. But they didn't even go as far as Qing Dynasty. But despite that, also rural industrial flourished. But still, I'm not saying private property is not important, but they are just far from sufficient. It was also happiness is a different matter. Of course, I didn't say about happiness, but industrialization. I mean, American Indians constantly tell the Americans, "We are so happy. We don't want your civilization. Why are you here killing us?" Americans say, you are not civilized, we are going to change you. So in this case, you have conflict with civilization. Eventually, only industrialized civilization wins the game. Qing Dynasty China refused to change. We like our civilization. We can produce lots of stuff you don't have. But why you want to change us? You want a free trade, we don't want it. Well, if you don't do that, you will be beaten. So this kind of game forced upon every nation, eventually become a competition across nations. That eventually led to First World War and the Second World War. But China today realized that we can only rise peacefully. There's no way you can rise through war. China is so large. And you have to find new ways to emerge. China has not even finished industrialization, but once you become as rich as the US, not that, just as rich as South Korea, how much global raw material supply can feed you? So China must figure out a new way, right? Not only rise peacefully, also make sure other nations rise together. Otherwise, there's no market, the purchasing power to support you. So China, that's why I say China is the only superpower in the global history, deliberately willing to help poor nations to grow. Maybe US but did not go all the way. Before US, every nation just try to grab other nations' resources and use them as a market. That's it. But now, China can no longer do that. You're too large. Even you want to do that. There's no way. So you have to learn the American experience, find a way to help with the US to create a global institutional setting, and so that a poor nation can rise together with China. So we can say more. Yeah, that's my...
Thank you very much. Very, very quick.
Yes, well, sorry, it will not be quick. I think you very rightly showed that this institutionally based theory has very important limits, and it cannot claim to explain everything. So you have done a very good job on this front. Thank you very much. Next, you have also, and this is very important, refocus the attention on industry. Everybody talks about development. You talk about industrialization. This is what we should be looking at. This is a priority. How did England industrialize? Well, with industry, sorry. Not with services. India will not make it. So now you have conjectures about a chronology for different countries. Has to be taken to the data. You need to look at industrial output data to know whether your chronology is vindicated or not for Japan, for China, and even more, you need to look at factory industrial output data. Because handicrafts, I'm sorry, you're not going to industrialize with handicrafts.
No.
So you need to look at all these things. And then when you start looking at that, maybe some of the evidence is not going to match perfectly your conjectures. One of them Before the Second World War, for many decades...
Eric,
sorry, I finish. I will be carrying on at 3:15 in the presentation I'll make with the evidence on that, but I just finished one sentence. Before the Second World War, the rate of growth of industrial output in China for many decades was higher than in Japan and Russia. So that may be a little bit, I don't say I'm a supporter of the Kuomintang or 1927, and this started actually in the late 1890s. It didn't start in 1911. So we have a number of puzzles, and one of the puzzles which I will support this afternoon is that the uniqueness of China is not in its rapid growth.
I got your question.
The uniqueness of China is in its normal growth. China is the only country which can sustainably grow in industrial output at 7% per year from 1890 up to now. So I think we should certainly refocus the attention, and thanks a lot for having done a good job about this.
Thank you very much for your question, and I would like to come to your seminar, but because of other commitment for activity, I really hope you can send me your work. But let me respond quickly.
I think this is misbehavior. We are all attending your presentations, and you are escaping when we start talking. So should we also not go to our parallel sessions and go to social events?
Just let me be short response. I think you're very correct pointing out that proto-industrialization does not automatically jumpstart first industrialization. Although, in my view, it's a necessary stage you have to go through. But it does not automatically lead to next. So all these stages I portrayed out. Earlier stage is a necessary condition for move to the second stage, but it's not sufficient. And to the pinch link between stage is state. So the reason I think Qing Dynasty proto industry, despite its very flourishing advanced, without the help of the state and unified development strategy to help them to create a global market, they would never jumpstart further industrial revolution. And same thing for other nations. India had the best craftsmen or proto-industrial industries in textiles, but there was no state help. And so if Song Dynasty China giving that level of technology and that level of proto-industry, if there was this conscious mercantilist development strategy in the mind of the state to help create a global market through their technology of shipping technology, not just show off, China would be the first nation to start the industrial revolution, not the UK. So you go through that state, but later on, for later developed countries, you have to nurture your proto industry in the first. Okay, but that's not sufficient. Once they grow, I mean, they're all primitive technologies, you have to jumpstart the first industrial revolution, which requires even better infrastructure and a better market condition, also better institutions. Institutions are endogenous. You go step by step. Without a highway, you put a highway limit writing the book, doesn't help. Even when you build a highway, you just put a speed limit there without a policeman, doesn't help. Those institutions come endogenously and come through because of huge amount of cost, therefore come. But thank you for your question. I talk to the organizers, see if I can skip their activity and come to your talk. So make you feel better. Thank you very much.
Okay. Thank you very much, everybody, for